Okay, well, just again, to echo Therese, welcome to, this is actually the third chat that we have focused for PBIS teams this summer. This is part 2 of a two-parter on reestablishing your Tier 1 system. So I'm Jenny Kelly. Kat will be here as she just mentioned, so we welcome you. The first 2 chats are listed here with a link to the recording and the handouts. So the very first one, you can see the description there. And then last week, when we did part 1 of this reestablishing your Tier 1, we covered expectations and rules, teaching and reinforcement system, looking at modifications and changes that may need to be made given the different situation that we're returning to school in. So if you haven't had a chance to check into those, please go back and look at those. Here's the link. It's also just right on our front page of our web page. So we encourage you to check those out if you hadn't had a chance to listen. So today, what we're going to be continuing our discussion on, focusing on effective discipline and data use. And then at the end, Kat will touch some on resources for tiers 2 and 3 systems. We will be talking about discipline because we know there are going to be probably some challenges that you all hadn't had in the past. Okay. So what we know now is that our world has drastically changed over the last 4 to 5 months. And many of our staff, students, families have endured a lot of challenges, sickness, death, the fear, anxiety around this COVID-19, and all of the other situation going around with Black Lives Matter and protests and those sorts of things. So we have a lot of emotions that are still very raw. So we want to always remind everybody that we approach PBIS implementation through a trauma-informed lens. And you can see here the definition, but I really want to focus, if you look at the bottom bullet, and this was 2014 research that has found over 50% of general population experiencing at least one trauma in their lifetime. I would guess if research were done more recently that number would be a lot higher. So we know that we have all of us coming back to this new schooling situation, having experienced many of us trauma and continuing. So it's important that we look at what we're doing through that lens. So this slide shows these are mostly delayed responses to trauma, but these are very common reactions. And these are behaviors that we may see in school and not necessarily linked to trauma, the impact that trauma can have. You can see just right across the board. The slide lists some of these impacts, and we may see some of these behaviors, and what we're asking you to do is recognize and keep trauma in front of mind when you see these behaviors that may be exhibited by students, and in many instances there may be staff that have some of these same behaviors. So the actual events that cause them, everybody has had different experiences through the last 4 or 5 months, is not as important as the feelings that people are experiencing as a result of their different impacts. Okay. So the big blue box, establish and maintain positive and trusting relationships. That is absolutely the key. The good news about people experiencing trauma, children, adults, that we are very resilient, and given the right environment and given the right supports, they can really work through and resume and lessen the impact of trauma. But what we have to have first and foremost is positive and trusting relationships, and that's going to be so critical when we come back to school this fall in whatever situation. When we look at PBIS, most people would put it kind of in that first box that says climate, building safe and predictive environments, because that's exactly what PBIS aims to do. But we also teach and reinforce skills, all about teaching. And we haven't as much promoted adult wellness, but what we know is if we have a nurturing, positive, supportive school environment with positive relationships, that will also promote adult wellness. And we'll touch on that a little bit more in this presentation. So PBIS, if you look at this, there's real foundational elements here of expectations, rules, and routines. We discussed these quite at length in last week, the first part one of our webinar. But we know from a trauma-informed practice and what we just saw in the previous slide that building safe and predictable environments is so critical for kids who have had their worlds turned upside down. So maintaining those expectations, we talked about some modifications that you may need to make or additions you might choose to make. Clearly rules, it would appear that if we go back fully brick and mortar, there will be new rules and routines that will be brand new. So that will all have to be taught. And you know that in a foundation for relationships is having these positive expectations, recognition, and acknowledgement. So we have to establish relationships with students and combine with the elements listed here before we can even get into the discipline responses. So we look here at what we don't want to do for any children, students, or even adults who have experienced trauma in their lives. What we don't want to do is re-traumatize anybody through our discipline practices. So you see here that some of the responses to discipline that may or may not be applied currently in your buildings, but have been or may be used, looking here at things like isolation and restraint and the feelings of helplessness, lack of control that kids have had over all these last months, that what we don't want to do is re-traumatize students by isolating them, removing them from that educational setting whenever possible. Allowing abusive behavior to continue, things like, boys will be boys, and sort of dismissing behavior. We don't want to allow that to continue to re-traumatize students. So you can see here that students need a voice. We need to be real careful as we go into a little more depth that Kat will in a couple of minutes of really looking at our discipline responses. But back on the previous slide where we talked about teaching is the very first response to a discipline event. That's what we need to always revert back to before we would ever get to any kinds of responses as strong as these here. And we would hope that those aren't occurring in our schools, particularly as students come back this fall after all the trauma and unpredictability that they've been living in. So we'll go to the next slide, and Kat, I think you take it from there.
So we are going to reference a couple handouts throughout the chat, and they're all within the live binder or within the link that Therese had posted into the chat. Therese, in a little bit, I'm going to ask you to just go ahead and repost that link again. I know it's helpful. People jumped in after we posted that link for us. But this slide, Jenny had just talked about the adult wellness piece. And right now, that is even more important than it was before this pandemic, especially as I know all of your districts are talking about what those plans are going to look like going back into schools. But we talked about it in the first of this series, as well as a little bit in the second. So we're coming back to it in every of these PBS team series. That idea of you have to put your mask on before you put your child's mask on. And I actually meant the plain masks, although now I know we are all very used to doing that with health masks. But the idea that adult wellness comes first because we can't take care of others till we're well, whether that's family members or educators in a school building. And so we talked about in the first chat, and that's why you see the little handout there, we talked about this in needs assessment with teams. So we've given you several links and resources, so we want to reference that again in light of self-care, some mental stress reduction that we can do that will help get us a gauge on how our adult staff is doing, and will also promote wellness or reduce stress. So we gave you several of those resources, so I wanted to reference that again. The slide picture, though, is one we've referenced in other presentations from a study that was done in 2016 that doesn't tell you anything new. Most of you on this call who are educators will know that if we're seeing teacher stress and teacher, the role of a teacher is one of the most stressful before the pandemic. What it does look at, though, is what contributes to that stress. So things like school organization. So as an example, right now, many decisions are being made outside. If those of you who are on the chat from a school level, maybe outside of your school, or from those of you at the district level, from those of you outside of a district. They might be, for example, the executive order that came from the state yesterday. So sometimes stressors come from policies outside of our power. But the important thing to know about what will reduce that stress is how our building or our district fosters some of the decisions made from that. So even if you are within a school level representation today, that leadership culture that you foster, for example, that we foster in a Pbis leadership team of getting staff input and having autonomy in decision making, that helps relieve teacher stress. So that's what is meant by that first bullet of school organization. It can be a stressor, and it can also be a way to reduce stress. And then, of course, the job description. Schools who are really good at positive school climate are good at balancing what's demanded of certain staff, even with dwindling staff coming, as we are all experiencing right now. So those are sources of stress, but something a school building can do that can balance that. And specific to that, we're going to talk about today how we develop our continuum of support that's cognizant not only of what's effective for kids and a continuum of response and being trauma informed, but also allows for teacher input or stakeholder input that helps reduce stress. The other feature we'll talk about within our discipline continuum is a social emotional piece. So when we teach those skills that Jenny just went through foundationally, and it's always hard for us, those of us that come in the part 2 of chats, because you'll hear us come back to part 1 all the time, those foundational prevention items that she reviewed quickly with you. So what we teach up front in our buildings, our expectations, rules, routines, or those of you that go a little deeper or will go deeper this school year using some of those social, emotional, internalizing skills, we're going to come back to those when we respond to problem behavior. If we don't attend to this, the visual from the study, of course, shows those things that we all know. It's going to produce teacher consequences of they won't want to come to work. We're going to have high turnover because they'll leave those schools or those districts. Same for those of you in district roles. That district climate, if we have negative district climate, we'll leave that district or have high turnover at that level. And we know that impacts student outcomes. So if we don't attend to stress of our adults or wellness of our adults, we lead to not only poor adult outcomes, but then poor student outcomes. We also know that will lead to decreased student and family engagement. And we're coming back to that a lot today in terms of trauma-informed and effective discipline response. So the article is there for you. It's very interesting if you'd like to look more into it. But again, the themes to highlight today is we're going to come back to this idea of you have to attend to the wellness of adults coming back. And we gave you some of those things we know work in terms of mental health well-being practices, attending to self-care. We gave you lots of resources to be easy, quick, practical to do that when you come back in your building. So if you weren't on that first chat, that handout's in there for you. The other big focus is we'll be coming back to that with how we support stakeholder input to our continuum of response and supporting adults through what we do in response to situationally inappropriate behavior and how we do it. So Jenny had introduced the idea of we're trying to take a trauma-informed lens as we go through this. However, the buckets on the slide, if you haven't seen this from Education Law Center, that promote trauma-informed discipline policies, these are the top recommendations. They will look familiar. They're most of the things that we promote in a PBIS framework approach. So first and foremost, as Jenny had already mentioned, we want to avoid things that we know re-traumatize. Exclusionary discipline is a huge re-traumatization factor. It's a mental health risk factor. We want to avoid that at all costs by focusing on things that are alternatives to that. And we'll be going through that a little more in detail in terms of continuum options. But we're always going to try to leave that as our last resorts. And then the middle one that had the longest words, I know some of you are like, she shouldn't left all those words on those slides, but I just thought a lot of them are really important. Because I'm sure most of you on this call will say, of course, that's how we operate. Not everyone does, especially if we're not in our best as adults in terms of stress level. You always want to come at this as the approach of kids are doing the best that they can, depending on what they've come from, and working from their biggest strengths, emotionally, physically, developmentally. Sometimes when we respond to behavioral errors, we don't always come from it with that. And it leads to things like bias that we don't want presence in our situations. It leads to more punitive responses. So that's, of course, one of the highest recommendations, to be trauma-informed, but also just to be a supportive adult that builds those relationships with students. Or those of us who are on parents, same roles as parents. I know one of the statements I always use with especially when I'm getting frustrated too, just like teachers or educators get frustrated, is that I know you can do it. I always use that statement a lot to show that belief in my own kids that we are there for them, we know we can do it. And I've heard so many good educators do the same, but that kind of illustrates that middle one. And we're going to talk a lot, well, I say a lot in our short time together, but de-escalation and redirection. Jenny said that a minute ago. We're always going to go first with a reteaching approach, which is why that prevention is so important. We have to know what our expectations are, what the rules are, the routines, in order to start with the first response to a behavior error or situationally inappropriate behavior being to redirect or reteach. Just like those of you who are teachers, when you teach your curriculum, you know it. So your first line of response to errors is to go back to that strategy or explicit instruction piece you just taught in that curriculum. So Jenny also mentioned we're coming back from a pretty stressful time. In fact, a lot of us on this call have had some stress with what's that going to look like. You can expect heightened emotions from adults and kids coming back, and that's a natural response. So we're going to really be beefing up that thought of de-escalation being our guiding principles in our continuum of response. We've already mentioned the forming relationships. You cannot forget about parents, caregivers, families. Those are strengths for our students. Fostering those relationships as partnerships is going to help us be more effective at that. If we don't approach those relationships or engage, then we will not have a lot of effectiveness in our responses. And same thing with I know a lot of you are like, of course we don't criminalize children, but the idea of it's that respect. So we model what we want to see. And we'll talk about that right off the bat with respectful redirections. We're going to talk a lot about the language we use, how important that is. So if some of you may not have seen this before, we've used it in several trauma-informed presentations, but Midwest Pbis had done a crosswalk of what we know to be some of our Pbis practices that many of you on the call are probably constantly supporting or teaching with your school teams or district, if you're a district team member with your district and school teams. So in terms of the critical practices we're covering today, we're on the discipline side. So some of those features that you will know and have been taught whenever you went through training is there's some really critical features that we have presence in our system as being as having a Pbis framework. But then on the right, you'll see why is that so important, not only for all kids, but for those impacted by trauma. And we're going to unpack a little bit of these in our session today. So first and foremost, having concrete, agreed upon problem definitions, being really clear on what those are. Of course, that starts with being clear on what we want to see. So the little slide that Jenny went over with our expectations, rules, routines, which again, I say that almost because I feel like at this time you kind of have to laugh sometimes. We don't really know yet what our safety rules are going to be. Some of you may be going into schools where we don't know that yet, but we will when we enter. So we're going to have to think about the errors that could occur in the same fashion, and we'll go through that in just a second. But having those clear definitions may seem like the most simplest practice, but it really helps in terms of creating that predictability and support. Clear definitions help adults feel safe and predictable, and it also helps students. And then we're going to talk or revisit, for those of you, most of you on the call probably that have been through Tier 1 Pbis training, on that idea of why we create consistent policies and procedures. So that discipline flow chart that we have at a school level. And then those of you at the district level, I know that often applies within your code of conduct or district procedures. But looking at, we're going to look through a sample of how that policy and procedure within a flow chart helps keep us consistent, predictable, as we keep saying that's going to be so important. We're going to talk through a couple of strategies or highlight a couple of strategies in that continuum that might be really important as we come back, if you weren't already considering them in your continuum of response. And last, and I will go ahead and be transparent, this will be one that I think we get to spend the least amount of time on today, but we'll revisit in later sessions, is the database decision making. And how using data can help us be trauma informed, as well as help us in a time where we are going back to, probably for any of us on this call, even if you worked in a fairly low risk factor or low needs school, where we're going to see more needs than we have before. So we have to put a meme in here to try to help, because we are in a time where I try not to say, those of you on the call, I know a lot of people are not liking it when people say the new normal. So I'm trying to stick with our current context. Our current context right now is when we reopen some of this in the cartoon, because we're trying, this is a coping skill for me, is humor. We're wondering, what's it going to look like when we reopen? If we are wearing masks, are they going to be distracting to kids? How are we going to establish that? Is it going to be safe to take them off in some cases or not? But those of us who know children and have been in education a long time know it could create some of what's happening in this cartoon, right? So what I'd like to ask is that Jenny mentioned new rules and routines. Just as you're listening and would be willing, chat in the chat box for me, what are some new rules or routines that you think are going to be really important to establish with school entry? New rules or routines that you already think are going to be very important established in school reentry, and maybe ones that you haven't had to before. And I put some examples there to get you thinking in case anyone wanted some examples. And Teresa, I'm going to ask you to help me with the chat because I can't see it that well.
You betcha, Kat. We're seeing suggestions of wearing a face mask, the arrival and dismissal processes, social distancing.
Great.
Yep, couple for social distancing.
Yes. Oh. And
recess procedures, having lunch in the classroom, health screening.
Thank you.
Yes.
Those are awesome. So I think we all get daily practice with this Pbis framework practice right now, because we're always wondering and trying to make the best decisions for what's the safety procedure when we go out places. What do we do to social distance? I know I talk with my kids a lot about that. So just the same when we come back into school, it's a newer setting than it was before all of this. So going over, once we know what those procedures are going to be, linking them to our expectations. And they talked a lot about that in the last chat. So we have to know that first, as I was saying, as far as establishing those new rules and routines. If we don't know that right off the bat, in terms of being preventative and reteaching those, you're going to experience lots of behavior problems. It's why schools choose to engage in Pbis as a school-wide framework. So even with these new pieces coming into a school year, then we have to think about what problem definitions might we need to revisit. So in most school campuses, we have some common problem behaviors that we will define as a school stakeholder group, and we'll talk about or use them as non-examples when we teach our rules and routines. So when we teach what's examples and non-examples, we might use some of those problem behavior examples there. But we might have some new ones right now. So a lot of you gave some nice examples of like the social distancing. That's a great one to use here, because if we don't specify what it means to social distance, what's been really nice in restaurants or anywhere you go, stores, they have little visuals, right, that are showing you how to be 6 feet apart from people. And, you know, some people might have laughed at that, but I love that. It's giving that nice, clear structure like we would in a classroom of what it means to be socially distanced, just in case people forget. And many adults have needed those reminders, as will our kids. So when we see, if our first step is going to be to reteach, having clear definitions of those might be really helpful when we reteach. And I gave some examples there that come to mind. Classroom disruption. We're going to have to think about as a staff what is considered classroom disruption, like we always do, but with some of our new routines or procedures. The other one I think of is following safety rules. What is going to be really tight with when we follow safety rules and not. So for example, my son went to a camp recently, and they were very good about the procedure on when they wear masks. If they were outside and had a certain distance, that's when they didn't wear masks. That helped him, that helped me as a family member. We were clear on the procedure. We felt that it was safe. So they did an excellent job. They clarified the procedure. He knew when he was supposed to have it on, and was being safe. And I knew as a parent what they were doing, which helps me as a parent to know and support them and him. So those are two examples I thought of. Because we only get you for a short time, if you want to see some clear definitions and what those look like, you might have some in your district, but we always offer the ones from RTIB. So Therese, thank you for being my fabulous assistant here. She's going to post that link in there since I realize you can't pull it off the slide right now. But those of you who go and get the slide deck handout, you'll have that link for you as some sample definitions. But this helps to overcome that re-traumatization piece of inconsistently reinforcing rules. If we don't start with common definitions, then we will definitely fall in that bucket of being inconsistent. The other piece we mentioned in the little box that the crosswalk we went through was that consistent policy. So this will look familiar to lots of you. And if it doesn't, it may have been a while since you've been through Tier 1 training or since you revisited this with your team. But we always go through that practice of establishing that consistent flow chart idea. So we want to have defined on a school campus, what is a teacher or staff managed behavior? And you see some of the buckets there that are important to that. Those are things that can be handled appropriately, quickly, efficiently, handled within that environment. And then we have some that are what we consider majors or office managed that might go up to a higher degree of response. This is very important to clarify those two, because if you don't, again, inconsistently applying rules, we might have some adults who send them way too quickly to the office to manage, or vice versa. We might have some that keep something in the class or that setting that maybe shouldn't be kept there. So we want to have consistent practice. So just defining that, making staff aware, letting them have buy-in into that process is a good overall practice for consistency, as well as being trauma-informed and helping people feel safe, adults and kids. And then of course the crisis incidents. Those are usually already defined for you by your district and your crisis procedures, but we know there are some that require that immediate response. And some of those more common ones are listed for you. There'll also probably be some included this year on health response. So for example, if we had a positive COVID case, in that case, what happens? And I know a lot of districts have already seen those come through. And then Therese, you just helped me out. I see the chat begin, so if you can stop me at any point if a question or comment comes up.
You were doing great, Kat. No questions so far.
Okay. And so let's go a step back. If this is the broad policy piece, one of the things we see in teams that we want to revisit right now is the teacher, or a lot of schools call this staff managed within that environment column. Sometimes we see struggles with what's that continuum of response going to look like. And so this is taken straight from our revised Tier 1 training, one, because we want to revisit some considerations for you. We know these continuums are going to be way more effective if they are addressing the attitudes, belief of the diverse students and families that you serve in your schools or your districts. So we have to have some engagement and stakeholder input from our families to make sure that's aligned with their attitudes and beliefs on certain types of behavior issues. So for example, I just gave you one on safety. We are going to be coming back to an environment where you're going to see heightened concerns of family on safety. So having some open, transparent communication about how you're handling that, as I've seen many districts do already with surveys or schools do, can help that. And we want to continue that response. The other piece is the staff buy-in and acceptability of staff. So if you remember in the staff wellness slide, I mentioned we come back to that. One thing we know that really helps school climate and staff wellness is that they have input and decision-making in things that they are asked to implement. So this is one of those buckets where you really want to not just give them a continuum of response, but get some feedback from them. with some offered supports and what those strategies are if needed. And so the handout that you have is not just to be a list of strategies for you, although I do think that's a helpful part of it. It gives you some explicit definition to effective strategies in a least to most intensive level, but it allows, little column with a red arrow, it allows you to use that in a way to get staff input. So we don't want to just hand out a flow chart to all of our staff that says these are our steps that we take, but we want to get some input from them on, is this something they think they could do, one, or two, do they agree with this strategy, or do they do an adaptation of it that might be more acceptable to them? So it's a nice tool to lead to some of that discussion with staff to get feedback, buy-in, and promote understanding of what that strategy is. Now, I will say from a practitioner standpoint in my schools, when I was in schools, this usually worked really well, not as a whole staff in most cases, but maybe we had feedback or discussion with our grade levels or in secondaries or content areas, and then gave that feedback. One, given smaller group discussion time, but two, having some of your peers with you for peer support really helped that discussion. So that's just a practitioner tip that I found worked well in my schools, especially since I usually was in very large schools. So breaking it up by that small group piece. So that handout is in the live binder for you, and we're gonna revisit a couple of strategies actually included on that list, and then a couple that maybe were an adaptation of a strategy on there. So as we go into the strategies, we're going under some guiding principles here to keep with our trauma-informed piece as we go. And one is from the trauma expert. If you've never heard of Dr. Bruce Perry, he is well known in the trauma and mental health field for a history of work in what trauma does to children's brains. We're not going to dive into that right now, although I know that sounds exciting. But the reaction of brain and how we react when we respond, that's very relevant to our conversation today. So the visual that you see right there goes off that idea when we're escalated. And if you think about yourself, because this applies to adults, children, if we're really upset and escalated about something, it's not the time to try to make me reason right off the bat, right? It's the same premise of, as adults, we wait till we send that email. If I'm really angry, don't send that email yet. Let's read it. Let's take a moment. Let's take a moment away from the computer to calm down. Then let's go back. Same idea as adults, but with kids, we want to think through our responses, allow for the idea to regulate first or calm. We want to give some options that we can calm before we then start to relate or discuss, and that endpoint start to reason. So I'm sure you've seen some situations where we try too quickly to go to either verbally digesting through what just happened or what you think or feel about that. And you want to make sure we include responses that give you a second to calm. And we're going to go into that in a little more detail. The other important feature to this idea of regulate, relate, reason, is that it's a lot of the ways we use our language is going to be really important when we respond. And then if you haven't seen the little quote up there, it's a really popular one, but very relevant to us coming back. And the only thing I would say is it's not just going to be little people. So if you think about us as an adults in this situation, even us as adults have been a little overwhelmed with big emotions. So thinking through how we handle that in our responses is something we're going to dive a little more into. That's a big guiding premise for us as we come back. It goes hand in hand with those of you who've been trained in de-escalation. So again, when we come back, we're going to have more heightened emotion than we're used to. Some of you may be used to that. Maybe you've had high-risk campuses that come from environments where I come with a lot of trauma exposure and I have heightened emotions or fight or flee response. Those of you who aren't, you can expect that you'll have more than that in your campuses. So same idea as the last slide. We want to keep that guiding principle of focusing on those strategies first that are going to help us de-escalate. We're going to start with redirection in just a second and the language we use when we redirect. Then going to things to give that chance to regulate first. So cooling off, using those safe spaces. I hear this strategy called all kinds of things. And that strategy is in that handout we just referenced, the calming corner. You might hear it, cool off. Lots of different ways this is applied, but that's that opportunity to regulate. So we want to start with that prevention first before we jump over to the reasoning part, but that comes after as far as the response piece. And we did provide that infographic in the live binder for you that gives some more illustrations of cool down. So first step is always redirection. We are always going to give the chance to correct that behavior and prompt what we want to see. So in any continuum, we're always starting with that as our first practice. And the definition for you is the verbal or nonverbal prompt to engage in that desired behavior when we're seeing something situationally inappropriate. It's why you keep hearing us come back to, we have to know what it is we want. I can't redirect if I don't know what my rule or my expectation was. So some of the examples there that you see are prompting. We're prompting there. Can you think of a different way to say that? We're prompting appropriate language. And then let's try to be efficient as you begin the lab assignment. It's going back to the tier 1 expectation. I know most of you have heard me before. In my house, it's always the be safe. I do a lot of, can we be safe while we do that? Because I have boys, they have a lot of movement. And so we're always having some errors on unsafety. So we always redirect back to the being safe part. Now, this strategy, even though it's first as a uniform strategy, we know there are even more progressive ways to use it. So you see there pairing it with some things is highly recommended. We'll talk about effective statements, in just a minute. Proximity control is when you come over a little bit closer. So what in a classroom, I might give a whole group redirection first. I really want to see how everyone's using quiet voice tone or level 1 voice tone if you're using like a rubric, why we engage in the small groups discussions. If I still see Kat or Therese still having trouble, I might then walk over and do some proximity and give that same reminder while I'm close to Therese or others. Or then progress like an individual redirection. So simple strategy, but you can get a little more intense with it as far as getting proximity control around. And then last but not least, we always thank the change in behavior, give feedback when the behavior changes. It's an instructional element. So whenever we see it change, we always say thank you for, or I really like the way. We're given that specific feedback that they changed the behavior. I mentioned the language is so important. So when we think about the one we just went through is simple, but we have to be respectful when we do that redirection. We don't want to be yelling out to embarrass. We want to be respectful in how we redirect. Even when we come over to proximity, we're not going to make it a point that we're trying to use that proximity to control that behavior, but just to use it as a very less intrusive strategy. We also want to think about, and this goes very hand in hand with effective statements that we'll mention, it is very calming when people use language that shows they're trying to understand. That calms adults, it calms kids. It is not calming if you think of an example where you've been really fired up or very not escalated. Then when someone says to you to calm down, it usually causes the opposite response. So here we want to think about, and it's called trauma-informed validation, but very consistent with, we'll talk about effective statements in a second. Your statements that you give to redirect can also reference what you're seeing in a way that is non-judgmental, and it provides safety, and it's recognizing or validating it's okay to feel that way. One I have to use all the time in school with kids that I worked with was anger. It was okay to be angry. We're all get angry. So I see that's very frustrating. I see that would make me angry. I understand. Trying to give them a second to see that they're upset. Just going to calm down is different because you're telling them exactly what to do. It's also going to escalate me a little bit because you're implying I'm out of control. So you'll see lots of examples over there on the right from a district in Indianapolis, a Midwest Pbis that gives some that they use in terms of alternatives specific to that one of calm down. And lots of examples. The article I referenced there, if you want a little more detail or want to share that article with staff, you're welcome to steal that. It gives this concept and it gives lots of examples in a nice practical user way. The other redirection piece that might be a step up is redirecting back to ways to cope or self-regulate. So I mentioned that in de-escalation. This is given some more specific examples of that. And then some of these might look like repeats from some of the past 2 sessions. For the centervention ones you see up there, for example, we've used a couple and I'm gonna revisit why. So in last session, we talked about that foundation of what we teach. If we teach already as part of our expectations, rules, routines, some of our ways to self-regulate, which is what we would encourage you to do. We don't want to teach self-regulation when we're already upset. We want to teach it as a prevention practice. So when students come in, we know they're going to have more worries. We know they're going to have more fears of safety. Starting with some of those activities like we usually do to build relationships and have to identify those worries like you see on the right can help with, one, it's okay to feel that way and build safety, that it's where we might all feel that way right now. But also then promote to, when I feel that way, what can I do? And so the square breathing that you see on the right, that is paired with this handout at that link that we've shared with you before, and we've shared on that needs assessment handout. But if I practice that strategy and know that the breathing is a strategy that works for me, we can prompt that when the student's having trouble. We don't want to prompt strategies that we haven't taught them already. That's frustrating for all and won't go well for us. The other examples you see listed there are simple things like rhythmic activities or music. I've seen lots of classrooms that use that as a way to calm. If we come back from, for example, recess, that we have a lot of hyper movement, our bodies are kind of hyped up. We might also just do more of that when we come back because of the stress we've all been going through. Visuals, I don't know if many of you have heard of like the old school lava lamp. I've seen preschool classrooms that actually make those. I've seen high schoolers that actually make those, but those ideas of seeing different colors and shapes like a lava lamp is often very calming to people. So the idea is any of those could work, but it's important that the individuals identify what works for them. Movement is another big one. I know movement's a big one for me. If I don't exercise, I feel a lot more anxious or worried. If I exercise, that helps me. So same for maybe I'm going to get to take a walk, or maybe I get to move to a different area of the classroom, for example. So there's one example of repetitive breathing right there, the square breathing. We've given many of those before, and there's lots of good apps that practice that for older students. So repetitive breathing is known to be a way to self-calm or self-regulate. So you might prompt that strategy in your calming space or cool down area. And then focused attention, I'm gonna give one more example. So if you do use a curriculum, an SEL curriculum, and this is from MindUp, in that particular example of MindUp, if those of you who use that curriculum, they go through routines. It's focused around, it really emphasizes self-regulation. So there's two examples where if that's the curriculum I use in my classroom, or I know a couple other districts like Duval, they use Calm Classroom. That's a routine for self-regulation. If I already use that to teach, that's what I'm gonna come back to here in my continuum of response. If I used MindUp, like this example, that's what I would come back to. If you use a second step, they teach ways to regulate. So in your classrooms and schools, if you already teach these skills, that's what you want to come back to in your calming or cool down response, not a new one that's unfamiliar. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I just switched like 5 slides there on me. That was exciting. So there we go. Sorry about that. So as far as coping or self-regulation, another quick one I want to use for an example from that same Indianapolis district is they use a strategy we're progressing up from the redirection or a cool down. If you're starting to see, and those of you who are in schools know, when you start to see an adult and a child having consistent trouble, I even do this as a parent when we're having a rough patch. Dual thought sheets are a kind of questioning you can use to build back that relationship. Or if you talk about student conferencing, sometimes we talk about student conferencing. This is a format of that from the mental health field, but where we complete together. So the student and adult when reconnection is needed. So we've all obviously moved to more intense strategy here because we're talking about both of us doing them. But using those questions to build support relationship that you see in some of the questions they asked, we're asking the we, how can we handle this together versus placing blame on the individual. And it goes hand in hand to me with restorative questioning, which we'll talk about in a second too. Okay, so the last one we'll talk about in terms of specific techniques. Many districts are starting to use restorative practices or restorative techniques within their continuum of response. If you haven't, that's okay. We just wanted to highlight them because we're going to use an example from the flow chart. One preventative practice, which is really important. We teach restorative practices through prevention first, so we build that relationship up, is using effective statements. Same idea to me as the trauma-informed statements that we've talked about. There's always a feeling or emotion. There's always an I statement, I feel, when, the behavior that you see, and what that causes. So I feel happy when Therese helps me by sharing links in the chat box today because it helps me as a presenter. You're teaching that you're illustrating the use of feelings, and helping students practice that. A lot of SEL curriculums, depending on what you use, teach this practice within their routines. But it's modeling that skill. Now, this can also be when there's a non-desired thing. So I feel frustrated when Therese interrupts me while I'm talking, because then I can't remember where I am. That's a statement at a thing I don't want to see. My caution with that is sometimes we get to blame. We don't want to blame, but we're trying to illustrate I'm getting more upset because I'm frustrated with. And then the other two that you see are more progressive responses, and starting to look at illustrating some of those feelings through a questioning or a chat method. Same idea, we're modeling the feelings that we've established, and we're trying to go to a method where we're using questioning to have to self-reflect on something and reason. So that's why they're a little more progressive. We've already had an opportunity to regulate here, and using that to now start to reason or build relationships back. And the restorative chats is the last, and for it's more intense. We're going to be using that to repair harm. So we don't want to see you trying to repair harm before we build that relationship, but these are all examples of restorative practices. Because I'm getting 5 seconds to review them with you today, if you want more information on those, we actually have a skill module that's recorded, or some of your districts I know might also do internal trainings on some of those techniques. So one reason we wanted to highlight those is an example we use to put it all together. So we talked about a policy you need to have that's predictable, safe, is that flow chart. If you remember, we said you got to define what's office managed, classroom managed, and or your crisis response. In this particular example, you're seeing there's steps on the classroom side and then on the office side, and they're integrating in the different continuum of response. So the handout we gave you before that we said use to build input with your stakeholders gives a lot of effective responses you could use. We've highlighted a couple today that have that trauma-informed lens to them that you'd want to consider. This example puts it all back together from an example from Martin that was adapted, where they integrated in, for example, some of those restorative practices that we just mentioned. So it helps build consistency, predictability, and integrate some of those in. And I'm so sorry that animated it on me. The other reason we like this one is because it gives the thing you hear me keep saying today, that discipline response is only effective if built on that prevention. So we've been ongoingly teaching what's desired behavior, replacement skills, and recognizing and rewarding those as we see them. Okay, so my last section here for the limited time we have left is we wanted to at least reference or remind some of the resources that we have in advanced tiers. We cannot, as we go back to school, assume that we can intervene on everyone who has heightened emotional response, because we're all going to have an increased level of that. But as we come back to campus, my hope for you in this last little wrap up is some things that you can do as a school team to get ready for that. So I put the links to our 2 live binders for you. Our tier 2 and 3 live binders give you some nice tools in terms of identifying evidence-based interventions, progress monitoring evidence-based interventions, and using decision rules to apply as we go and implement those interventions. So the first is, you have probably seen these questions before, and they are not different. We're always trying to evaluate that we have to see how healthy our core is first, because our schools cannot handle the capacity of everyone being intervened with. So some guiding questions we've given you before, you'll see some blue here, is our tier 1 system doing what it needs to do? That question is going to remain the same, but we've hopefully highlighted a couple of things for you that we're going to be focusing on a more enhanced or a stronger core, knowing that we have so much risk coming back to us. We're going to be teaching a lot more than we did before, because we're jumping back into a structure that we haven't been in, most of us, since the beginning of March. So we're going to ask those same questions, but know that as we make some of these adjustments, so for example, if we do beef up what we teach and focus on regulation routines like we talked about today, are we seeing most kids respond to that? Even with all this extra stress coming back, time in a consistent routine and environment, you will see a lot of kids respond to that. Structure is one of our biggest things to promote resiliency, even during the biggest time of risk. So you'll see a lot of kids respond. Those that don't have that response is going to be how we triage those that need more supports. And then the fidelity piece, we mentioned some of the tools that most of you are familiar with using, but that nothing we've gone over today hasn't been some of those elements of the effective discipline side of PBS, along with some of our other features that you wouldn't already be attending to as a PBS team. But we just tried to highlight some of those reminders for you that are going to be important going back in with some possible enhancements you might make. And if you see, well, we'll talk about that second, decision rules. But as far as the classroom side, remember that piece to staff wellness, focusing on checking in with our staff as part of just, it's not just about its effective classroom management, going, but how's our health doing there? Do they need more supports to establish their classroom environment? Or do they need someone to check in with them regularly depending on their stress? Maybe we have staff coming back that's had more exposure to a death in the family or a job loss in the family. Do we know who those adults are on our campuses? And is there a way to just morally check in with them? Things like peer mentors we know work really well in our teacher groups to reduce that stress. Stress. So if to the more nuts and bolts pieces, the instruction and management strategy we use, we do have those tools that we've always promoted as far as our classroom assistance tool that you see there. So last but not least, what some things are you can do now. In your school teams, I would encourage you to think about, before we come back, even despite not knowing exactly what it may look like, what are supports you have on your campus? So what are those social emotional skill groups you already have that you can implement or want to start? If you have curriculums, what are they and what do they focus on? And I gave some examples there. If you don't, do you want some lessons that you could pick up and use to supplement your expectations? And that would be fine too. The behavior education or check-in, check-out program we know helps establish good relationships for kids who have attention-seeking problem behaviors. And also as a way to give supplemental instruction in desired replacement skills. So we want you to think about just what do you have on your campus in preparation for kids coming back for Tier 2 supports. And then we gave you a little sample that can help structure this kind of taking stock or resource mapping of what you have. Not only what is it you have, but do you know, because this is going to help your teams have more fluid procedures, what's going to be the established criteria for them to go into that intervention, to progress monitor, and then to exit from that. So that grid's nice and simple from our friends in the Missouri project, and then we gave you an example completed with the check-in, check-out program. And then I kept mentioning the decision rules, and you would not have to have a decision rule for every measure that is on this screen that I'm using as an example, but some schools do. But I just want to use a couple to illustrate that idea. If we know we're going to have more intense needs coming back, like ODRs. If we're seeing more kids have discipline referrals than 0 to 1, which is what this school considers proficient, we know our core is not doing what we need it to do. So we might want to revisit that, consider some of those enhancements of what we teach kids and what we use in continuum of response to help promote that. So even if this was our decision rules for what's desired level or proficient, at risk or high risk, some of those may have to shift with the triage methods that we have now coming back, depending on how kids are responding. And then we want to have measures of internalizing concern when we come back to school. So on our Tier 2 binder I gave you, we have our example of our nomination process. That's a nice practical way to use that with school teams. In this example, there are 2 that could be related to internalizing, right? For those of you who might see those. Absences is one that might be correlated with internal. It doesn't definitely mean it's an internalizing issue, but could be correlated. And then nurse visits. If we're having complaints, we might have to visit a nurse. It could be because we're having more anxiety or worry, feeling unsafe, those kind of concerns. If that's an area you want more support, please feel free to reach out to your Pbis TA person. And like I said, take a look at some of our resources in the Tier 2 binder for screening and nomination. And because we are quickly running out of time, I'm gonna skip this example for a second and just wrap us up with our last 2. We encourage you, and it's in the binder for you, use one method of progress monitoring in Tier 2. Don't go crazy with multiple methods. It stresses staff out. And we definitely don't want to do that with the extra stressors coming back. So if you haven't heard of it on the call, the DPR, or some people do refer to it as a behavior report card, but this is a daily progress report. That method we train and teach and promote as part of the behavior education or check-in, check-out program. It's a part of that intervention with the ongoing feedback. Those of you who are already pretty proficient or use that method, we encourage you to consider keeping that method for some of the interventions you might do for internalizing, such as the trauma-informed care group you see on the right, or the example that I didn't get to unpack with you a little bit on the other side is from Second Step. The difference here is students, especially our older students, can start to self-rate themselves on how they're using some of those strategies. A teacher can also identify if they see kids using their calming strategies, but here you're going to be shifting to they're going to be rating their use of that strategy. So if you think back to that worry cup we looked at, that activity, the sequence will kind of be we identify worries, we talk through ways that help me cope with those worries, and then as a student, I can rate how am I doing using some of those strategies. So the method is the same. The adaptation is that they look at self-report or self-rating of those. Along with some of these that you see, teachers could also rank if they're observable examples of that internalizing concern. And then tier 3 is how we're going to end, just referencing some examples. We just gave you this to give some consistent examples to definitions of what tier 3 supports look like. Considering on your campus is not just those for behavioral, like our functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plans, but our individual therapies or approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy that might be on a campus. And we also want to provide you with some considerations in how you partner for services. So if we don't have enough staff that's trained to provide some of our resources you see listed here, how we partner with outside agencies. And that could be at the district or at the school level. And then last is that binder I mentioned, some nice progress monitoring for tier 3, as well as considering your current practices with tier 3. I know I've heard a lot of my districts wanting to revisit some of their policies and procedures with that. And then some really nice follow-up resources for you in terms of thinking functionally about kids with internalizing behaviors. Some of our colleagues did a chat on that, or basically chunking that functional behavior assessment. If you want to see more on that, it's from Kathleen Lane's group. That's excellent. So I know I've run past my time and I'm so sorry. And Therese, can I ask if there's been questions or concerns I should address?
Yeah, actually, Kat, there was just one that came up right towards the end here from Melissa. She asked about tracking counselor visits, I think probably in terms of identifying students with internalizing needs.
Yeah, great question. So that's part of the MOU offering there that we're partnering, and I'm going to go ahead and help Therese out. Please complete that poll as I know you're running out of time or need to run somewhere else. Alyssa, I like the idea of keeping some consistent communication between a therapist or counselor and seeing kids. We often would work that out on a campus. So if it works for them, something they already complete as part of their agency guideline, great. Can they just provide that so we can use that as part of our problem solving process? It's only going to show me attendance, but perhaps they might have a way of indicating in their agency guidance of how the child did during the session, behaviors, engagement that wouldn't break confidentiality. Any notes like that to me would be helpful in terms of monitoring sessions or visits. But the bare minimum of just attending sessions would, yes, be helpful. We also encourage you to think about what strategies are they working on or skills in counseling, because we could help promote those with our staff in the classrooms. So if I was working on a student, for example, and when I was counseling, then it might have been on anger management. And so what strategy was the teacher going to prompt with them? And I always ask the student, I'm going to talk with your teacher about this. Do you want to talk about it together with us? So she can help and support you to use that strategy in the classroom. So I'd encourage you to think about some of those with generalization, but the idea of tracking session is a great start to fidelity tracking with adding some of that in. But some of the MOUs that you'll see will kind of go through agreements on services like that. I hope that started to answer your question. Okay, if there's other questions, I'm happy to hang out. And I know Jenny already had to go today, but we thank you for spending your time with us. And like I said, I'll hang out if there's additional questions. And please reference all the resources in the live binder since we had such brief time to focus on them and follow up with anything we can help with.